1776. The number echoes in every American textbook, in every fireworks show, in every story of heroism and freedom. It's the year etched in school walls, declared as the birth of liberty, the rise of a nation built on defiance and dreams. But what if I told you that the real 1776, the raw, bloody, frostbitten truth wasn't glorious at all? That the revolution didn't surge forward like a lion. It limped, it cried, and at one critical point, it almost died. Not because of overwhelming British firepower, not because of traitors hiding in plain sight, but because of hunger, because of cold, because of a single silent night so tense, so close to disaster, that it was nearly forgotten in the rush to write a cleaner history. This is not the story of powdered wigs and elegant declarations. This is the story of bleeding feet in the snow, of soldiers with no boots, chewing leather belts for food, of the filth, the fever, the frost, and the fear that nearly shattered the revolution before it had a chance to live. And at the center of it all, a towering figure, celebrated in marble and myth, George Washington. But tonight, we peel away the legend. Tonight we uncover the secret he took to the grave. Because this is the real 1776. And it's far darker than you were ever told. Picture it, a black January night. You're not watching history unfold, you are history. You're a 17-year-old boy from Pennsylvania, your rifle older than your father, your rations gone, your body shaking so violently you fear your bones might break from within. You're surrounded by 3,000 other men, some barefoot, some bleeding, some too weak to stand. You don't know how to fight. You were a farmer 2 months ago. Now you're here, in the middle of the woods, on a suicide mission whispered about in trembling voices. The American cause, they say, is righteous. But right now, it's also collapsing. Your commander, General Washington, has put every last shred of hope into this one night. There's no backup plan, no reinforcements. Just a crossing, across frozen waters, into enemy territory. In total silence. One mistake, one misstep, and the entire revolution dies here, tonight. But let's rewind, because this didn't happen overnight. By the start of 1776, the revolution was already crumbling. The British had seized key cities. Morale in the Continental Army was at rock bottom. Desertion wasn't just common, it was daily. The idea of freedom was starting to sound like a cruel joke told to starving men in snow-covered tents. George Washington was watching his army die not from bullets, but from disease and despair. Letters sent back home begged for shoes, for salt, for anything. The bodies of American soldiers weren't buried. They were frozen stiff, upright in the snow, makeshift scarecrows for anyone still thinking about joining the cause. And still, Washington refused to quit, because in his mind, there was one chance left. One insane, desperate maneuver. One roll of the dice against an empire. He would need silence. He would need courage. He would need the freezing night air to hold its breath, just long enough. And so, we arrive at that moment. 3,000 men. No sound but the creak of wagon wheels, the crunch of ice underfoot, the wind screaming like a warning. You carry your musket in shaking hands. Your breath fogs before your face, quickly whisked away by the cruel air. You've been ordered not to speak, not to light fires, not to cough. The British are just beyond the next ridge. If they see you, hear you, sense you, you're dead. But you push forward, one foot, then another, because behind you is failure, and ahead of you is the last fragile thread of hope. This is the story we're telling tonight. Not the story of a glorious declaration, but of the night when America was minutes from vanishing. A night when silence was louder than cannon fire, when one accidental gunshot nearly doomed everything, and when George Washington made a decision that no sane commander would ever make. And somehow, it saved a nation. So, as you sit back and watch this video, remember, the revolution wasn't born in speeches. It was born in mud, in blood, in ice. And tonight, we'll walk through that night together. Through the whispers, the trembling hands, the frostbitten feet, and the impossible silence. This is the untold horror of 1776. The night America almost died. It's January 1776. The world around you is white blanketed in snow, shrouded in fog, and frozen in silence. You're just 19 years old, barely more than a boy, a farmer's son from the outskirts of Pennsylvania, who joined the cause with fire in your chest and hope in your hands. But now, you're starving. Your skin is blistered from the cold, and hope is dying faster than the men beside you. You haven't eaten in 2 days. Not really. There was some boiled bark, a spoiled apple core, a crust of bread traded from a dying comrade. Your stomach doesn't growl anymore. It twists, it aches, then it falls silent like it's given up on you too. Your boots, they're frozen to your skin. No, not just cold frozen. When you try to take them off, your skin comes with them. You wrap rags around your legs now. Bloody stiff rags. Frostbite doesn't knock politely. It creeps in like death, quiet, merciless, irreversible. First your toes, then your fingers. You've seen a man lose his nose, blackened and shriveled like burnt paper, and there's nothing anyone can do. The men around you, some are coughing blood, some have stopped coughing altogether. Pneumonia, dysentery, gangrene. There's no real medicine here, just whiskey, wet bandages, and prayers. You buried 3 friends yesterday. One was your cousin. You didn't cry. There are no tears left in your body. Even if there were, they'd freeze before they hit the ground. This is the Continental Army. The army they'll one day call heroic. The men whose names will be chiseled into stone and turned into statues. But right now, it's a shivering, bleeding, barely breathing mob. A patchwork of farmers, cobblers, fishermen, and kids some as young as 12, wrapped in torn wool, clutching rusted muskets, held together by little more than rage and ragged dreams. They'll tell you George Washington was a brilliant general, but the truth? In the winter of 1776, he was holding the army together with spit, string, and sheer stubborn will. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered, and worst of all, he was out of time. The British, they're inside Boston, warm, dry, fed. Their red coats are clean, their boots polished. Their cannons shine under torchlight, aimed right at the American camps outside the city, and they're laughing at you. They know your army is starving. They know your men are dying faster than they can reload. They don't even bother to attack. Why would they? Winter is doing their job for them. But here's the part no one teaches in school. The American Revolution almost ended that winter, not from bullets, but from frost and fear, and the slow, silent death of morale. In early January, the Continental Army looked like it might collapse completely. Thousands deserted, hundreds froze, and those who stayed, they didn't stay because of orders or discipline. They stayed because they believed in something vague and fading, but real enough to keep them from running. Freedom. That word got passed around like a ration. It didn't fill your belly, but it gave you just enough strength to hold the line. One soldier wrote in his journal, "I have eaten nothing of substance in 4 days. My fingers are black. I fear they must come off soon. I dream of home, but no, I must stay. For if I leave, there is no more America." Another scribbled, "The snow is red with our blood. It crunches underfoot. I no longer know what day it is, only that we have not yet been defeated." Washington read these letters. He saw the dying men. He walked among them. And he knew that if he didn't act soon, the revolution would bleed out in the snow. This wasn't a war of strategy anymore. This was a war of endurance, of grit, of how long you could hold on when everything was telling you to let go. They say the revolution was about freedom. But for these men, in January of 1776, it was about survival. Washington was desperate. He began crafting a plan, a final attempt to turn the tide. A suicide mission that would cross a frozen river, sneak behind enemy lines, and strike the British where they least expected it. It was madness. But madness was better than dying slowly in the snow. The bleeding winter was just the beginning. But George Washington, he wasn't ready to surrender, not yet. Not while there was still breath in his body. He knew the British thought they had already won, that the winter would finish what their bullets hadn't. But Washington wasn't a man of easy defeat. He had a plan, a desperate, insane, suicidal plan. Fade to map of New York to Massachusetts. Cut to aged parchment and frostbitten landscape animations. He needed cannons, big ones, and lots of them. But they were hundreds of miles away. Fort Ticonderoga, captured months earlier, and the path to get them, mountains, snowdrifts, frozen rivers, all waiting to kill anyone stupid enough to try. Enter Henry Knox, a 25-year-old former bookstore owner. No military background, no logistics experience, but one enormous asset: belief. He believed he could drag 60 tons of iron artillery across 300 miles of frozen wilderness. He believed he could do it with oxen, sledges, ropes, and pure madness. In December 1775, Knox set out on what would later be called the noble train of artillery. But in the moment, it was the dumbest thing anyone had ever tried. He started with a dream and ended with a nightmare. Wagons broke, men fell into icy rivers. Frozen limbs turned black with frostbite. At one point, a sledge carrying a massive cannon plunged through the ice into the Hudson River. The men stood around for hours, ropes in hand, trying to lift it back out, barely alive, soaked to the bone, pulling 5,000 pounds of metal in a snowstorm. And yet, somehow, he did it. By mid-January, Knox and his team arrived. 60 cannons, from small mortar to massive 24-pounders, all lined up on the snowy hills outside Boston like the teeth of a god. But this wasn't a victory lap. The cannons were frozen, many unusable, and the powder wet. The men half. But Washington, he saw hope. Because those British soldiers, cozy behind Boston's walls, they didn't know the cannons were useless. They only saw iron death staring down at them from the hills. Washington ordered a silent move. In the dead of night, his men hauled those monstrous weapons up to Dorchester Heights, a hill that overlooked Boston and its harbor. They worked in pitch black. No talking, no light, just shovels and frozen ground and boots in crusted snow. When morning broke, the British were stunned. Overnight, the Americans had turned a hill into a fortress, and just like that, the siege of Boston was over. Not with a battle, but with a bluff. Washington didn't fire. He didn't need to. The British, humiliated, evacuated Boston in March 1776. No cheers, no glory, just cold bodies in threadbare coats. And a miracle that should never have worked. This was Washington's first real win. But it came at the cost of insanity, frostbite, and the will of a man who refused to let America die. And yet, this was only the beginning. It was the dead of night. The moon, half hidden by a veil of icy fog, barely lit the snow-covered ground. The only sounds, the distant caw of a crow, and the crunch of boots across the frozen Delaware River. George Washington stood on the banks, his breath like smoke in the bitter air. In front of him 3,000 exhausted men, farmers, shoemakers, schoolteachers turned soldiers. Behind him an army of redcoats, sleeping warm and well-fed in Trenton. Washington's mission? Unthinkable. A surprise attack, in the dead of night, in a blizzard, against the most powerful army in the world. But he had no choice. They were out of food, out of morale, out of time. The plan was simple, but impossible. Cross the river under cover of darkness. March 9 miles through a snowstorm, and strike at dawn. But nothing about that night went right. The ice on the Delaware cracked and groaned beneath their weight. Some men slipped and fell, soaking their boots in near-freezing water. Others struggled to push cannon wheels through snowbanks taller than a man's waist. Still, they pressed on, because in Washington's words, victory or death, there was no turning back. And then came the first omen. A soldier collapsed, not from a bullet, but from frostbite so severe that his legs turned black before morning. Another man coughed just once, but it was enough to echo across the frozen river. The tension was unbearable. Every step forward could be their last. Then, disaster. A man stumbled on a patch of ice. He fell backward, and his musket fired. The sharp crack of gunpowder shattered the silence like glass. Echoes bounced off the frozen river, across the trees, and straight toward British sentries camped less than 50 yards away. Every man froze. Washington's officers turned to him, eyes wide in panic. "Sir, should we retreat?" Washington didn't blink. Instead, he whispered a single terrifying command. "Tell them to stop, freeze, no sound." And so they did. 3,000 men, standing perfectly still, in the dark, in the snow, with death just yards away. The next 3 minutes felt like eternity. You could hear the wind whistling between rifles, the clink of frost on metal buttons, and somewhere a man silently weeping. One slip, one whisper, and the entire mission would be lost. But then, nothing. The British never responded. Whether it was the fog, the cold, or fate, the redcoats never heard the shot, never saw the silhouettes just beyond the tree line. Washington exhaled, just once, and gave the signal to continue. They pushed forward, hour by hour, frost turning eyebrows white, snow climbing to their knees, and yet not one man spoke. Not out of discipline, but fear. The silence became sacred, a cloak of invisibility, a pact between ghosts. By the time the first pale light of morning touched the horizon, they were within striking distance of Trenton. Washington drew his sword, looked at his men hollow-cheeked, frostbitten, barely standing, and gave the order, advance. The assault began with brutal precision. The British, caught in their beds, hung over from Christmas celebrations, never stood a chance. It was over in 45 minutes, and for the first time in months, America had won. Not just a skirmish, not just a victory, but a miracle. Washington, real quote, "The fate of unborn millions now depends under God on the courage and conduct of this army." But what most people never hear about, what they never read in textbooks, is that moment before the victory. The moment where the mission should have failed, where one mistake nearly turned 3,000 men into frozen corpses on a silent battlefield. That was the night America almost died, and no one ever talks about it. That silence, those breathless, frozen minutes, didn't just spare lives, it saved a revolution. Within days of that ghostly near-fatal mission, General George Washington would gamble everything again. Only this time, the enemy wasn't just winter, it was overconfidence. December 26, 1776, the Battle of Trenton. Picture it, just after Christmas, while most American soldiers were still numb with cold and defeat, Washington saw an opening, a critical flaw. The British had left Trenton in the hands of their allies' Hessian mercenaries. Elite German fighters, yes, but fighters who had been celebrating the holiday with brandy and arrogance. One American scout reported, "They sing into the morning, they do not expect attack. Their commander Raoul is drunk and prideful." One American scout reported, "They sing into the morning, they do not expect attack. Their commander Raoul is drunk and prideful." By morning they reached Trenton. The Hessians, sleeping off their celebration, ever stood a chance. In just 90 minutes, the Continental Army captured nearly 1,000 enemy soldiers, without losing a single American life in battle. It was a shock to the world. It was hope. It was rebirth. I had expected death. Instead, I saw our flag rise in a place we once thought lost. God was with us, or perhaps madness was. Washington's gamble had paid off, and that musket fired accidentally just days before might have changed everything if the British had heard it. Ask yourself this. What if the British had been more alert that night on the ice? What if that accidental shot had triggered an ambush? What if Washington had ordered a retreat, thinking the plan was blown? History would not know the Battle of Trenton. The Continental Army might have dissolved by spring, and the Declaration of Independence, a forgotten dream written in invisible ink. The British were certain the rebellion would collapse under its own weight. They didn't account for something else. Not strength, not numbers, but raw, reckless persistence. That's what Trenton proved. Soldiers wrote home with pride. Recruits who were about to desert re-enlisted. The world, France especially, took notice. The colonies had backbone. They had a chance. But it all came back to that one night, that cursed, frostbitten, half-forgotten night, where 3,000 men stood silent in the dark. And somehow, by mercy, miracle, or madness, their footsteps went unheard. The fate of unborn millions will now depend, under God, on the courage and conduct of this army. He wasn't being poetic, he was being honest, because the revolution had nearly ended before it began, and if it had, there would be no America as we know it. That's the horror they don't teach you. Not just the bloodshed, but the silence, the terror of waiting, the knowledge that your next breath could be your last, and that the future of a continent depends on whether or not you sneeze. The war would rage on for years. Yorktown, Valley Forge, countless dead, but Trenton, that was the ember. That moment when the flame of rebellion nearly went out, then flared to life again. We remember the victories, the signing, the fireworks, but we should also remember the cold, The silence, the narrow icy edge on which history was balanced. If this story shook you, if you felt the ice crack beneath your feet, comment "I would have stood still." Hit like so more people learn the hidden truths of history. And subscribe, because next time, we uncover how a failed banker turned spy almost brought Washington down from the inside. History isn't clean, it's dark, and it's closer to collapsing than you think. This victory wasn't heroic, it was terrifying. Yes, Trenton had been won. Yes, flags were raised and spirits lifted. But when the cheering died down, the silence returned. The cold, the rot, the trauma. Those who survived the winter missions of 1776 and 1777 didn't come home as heroes. Many didn't come home at all, and those who did, they carried invisible wounds. The birth of American trauma. Long before the term PTSD existed, these men knew what it meant to be haunted by the screams of frozen comrades, by the image of fingers blackened by frostbite, by the smell of rotting feet still attached to the living. Here is a letter found in Soldier's Archive. The sound of the wind now gives me dread. I see their eyes when I close mine. The dead, they do not blink. That was Private Samuel Cooper, aged 22. He survived Trenton, but lost 3 toes and most of his hearing from frost and cannon fire. He died 5 years later, not from wounds, but from what the records called nervous fits. He wasn't alone. The hidden horror of frostbite. In the medical journals of Dr. Albagens Waldo, a surgeon at Valley Forge, we find pages of grisly descriptions. Feet that must be cut, noses black and falling away. Men weep when we pour warm water, not from pain but from fear. Washington's army had no winter uniforms, no reliable boots. Men wrapped their feet in gunpowder-soaked cloth, hoping the heat would keep the frost away. It didn't. Amputations were often done without anesthesia, teeth clenched on sticks, or screams swallowed to avoid demoralizing others. Some didn't scream at all, not because they were brave, but because they were broken. Starvation, the unseen enemy. And while winter was merciless, it wasn't the only killer. Hunger stalked every camp. Rations were a joke. A soldier might go days on nothing but stale hardtack, moldy flour, or if lucky, a chunk of salted meat. There are accounts of men boiling leather for broth, of eating dogs, rats, bark from trees. One unit reportedly found a horse frozen in a ravine. They cooked it. They didn't care that the meat was green. We ate in silence like beasts. No one blessed the meal. We knew better. Desertion, the quiet exodus, the pain, the cold, the hunger, it broke men. Between late 1776 and spring 1777, over 2,000 soldiers deserted. Many didn't leave for the enemy, they just left to survive, to find families, to escape madness. And Washington, he understood, but he couldn't allow it. He wrote, "To let one man flee without consequence invites the collapse of the whole." So punishments were brutal. Some deserters were hanged, others flogged until the skin peeled from their backs. All were erased from honor. But the men who stayed, they weren't saints. They were just enduring, survivors of a hidden war. We call them the founding generation, but they were also the first broken generation. Soldiers who fought not just redcoats, but their own minds. There are records of men who never returned to town life, who wandered forests, who slept with weapons under their straw beds for decades after peace was declared. I hear drums in my sleep. I rise to no army, just a wife who fears me. What price did they pay for survival? Not just limbs, not just years, but peace. Peace of mind, peace of heart, the truth behind glory. We love to tell the story of 1776 with fireworks and flags, but the men who lived it, they would not have called it glorious. They called it agony. They called it necessary. They called it madness. They didn't win because of some divine genius. They didn't outsmart the empire with elegant strategies. They won because they endured hell and kept walking, through blood, through frost, through fear. They won because they endured hell and kept walking, through blood, through frost, through fear. If you made it this far, thank you. You just walked through a forgotten part of American history. Comment below. They endured hell, to honor the real soldiers, not the statues. Like this video if their silence shook you, and subscribe, because next time, We expose how a failed spy in Philadelphia almost handed the revolution to the British for a few coins and a woman. History isn't clean, it's raw, and those who survived it were never the same again. So, the next time you hear about 1776, don't just think of flags and fireworks. Don't think of grand speeches and powdered wigs. Don't picture parades and patriotic posters. Think of this: a 17-year-old boy shivering in a tent with no shoes, praying his frostbitten toes make it through the night. Think of the men who stood still in the dark, while death whispered inches away. Think of their breath freezing in midair, as they waited for the world to end or to begin. Remember the stench of rot, of dying flesh, of wool soaked in sweat and blood. Remember the silence, not the kind you find in peace, but the kind before a musket goes off and ends your friend's life. Because America wasn't born in glory, it was barely born at all. This story wasn't written in golden ink. It was carved into ice, etched into bone, etched into the minds of men who never came back. Not really. We honor the founding fathers, but let's not forget the unfound soldiers. The boys who froze beside a cannon. The ones who screamed when the saw came out. The ones who didn't scream at all. The revolution wasn't clean. It wasn't a march of ideals. It was desperation, chaos, madness held together by a thread. And still, they held on. Not because they were fearless, but because they were too stubborn to die. They didn't win because they were destined. They didn't win because they were divine. They won because on one frozen night, they stood still and were not seen. If you felt the frost, if this story shook you, if your breath caught in that silent night, hit the like button. Not for me, but for the boy who bled into snow so you could listen to this in warmth. If you think you would have stood still that night, comment below. Survived that one word. It's our tribute to every soul who saw the edge and didn't fall. And if you want more than myths, if you want raw history, the kind they hide in footnotes and burn in textbooks, subscribe, because next time we meet the man whose drunken mistake may have cost Britain the war. One bottle, one bad choice, one ripple in history that changed everything. The war wasn't won by heroes alone. Sometimes, it was lost by fools. This episode of Dark Days of History was written to give voice to the voiceless, the frozen, the forgotten. Share this video with someone who believes history is black and white. Let them see the gray, the blood, the silence, the scream that never came. Thank you for watching, and remember, every flag you see flying in the sun was once dragged through the snow. They didn't just survive history, they became it.